I am very excited. I love the fact that there are so many C++ conferences happening. 5 years ago, there was nothing, and now here we all are. And all these happy faces. I usually talk about code. I've spent a lot of time caring about writing good, especially C++ code. So it needs to be fast, it needs to be correct, but it needs to be more than that, right? It needs to be understandable and sensible, and you may have heard me use words like reassuring and pleasant. And today, I don't want to talk about the code. I want to talk about the people who write the code. So let me start with the title. This picture is from 1937. A man called Herbert Morrison was not doing a live newscast. People sort of misremember it. He was doing the very first recorded live, if you will, news reporting for radio. Later, people put his narrative over silent newsreel footage, so you kind of feel like maybe he was a TV reporter, but it was 1937, okay? And he was recording to disc. The discs were to be driven back to the studio that night and played, and then because it was a national story, to be played throughout the US the next day. What you need to know about Herbert is he wasn't just the first person who wasn't sitting in a studio reading a typewritten script. You need to understand, he was basically coming to an iPhone launch, right? Or a Tesla launch, not a SpaceX launch, okay? This was this amazing, glamorous, rich people thing that was shrinking the world, and we live in the future. And he was there to cover that as a nice, safe, modern technology story. And it blew up. And dozens of people died. Horrible deaths all around him. And he's talking into a microphone. And he has no training on how to stay calm in that situation, because he's literally the first person who's ever been asked to do it. So if you've heard the recording, his voice breaks. He says, "This is terrible." He says it's the worst thing ever. And yes, he says, "Oh, the humanity." He actually pauses the recording several times to try to get his composure back, but he doesn't get his composure 100% back. Now, this is an educational slide that I found where someone who's actually covering, what makes Zeppelins explode. But that's, as you know, not what the picture and the phrase get used for. Know Your Meme says that this is used to ridicule sentiments that the meme user deems overly sentimental, right? To put people in their place, because you know what? Your problem's not really that bad. And it's funny, but it has something else in it. It has in it that you need my permission to show emotions, right? That if someone makes your coffee wrong, or if there's nothing you can eat at the company picnic, well, did dozens of people die a fiery death late at night? No. So suck it up, buttercup. And we do this in this industry. We police each other's emotions. Apparently, I can decide whether or not you get to be upset about your coffee. I'm not clear. I don't remember giving permission to other people about my upset level on my coffee, yet they will take it. We have a rule. No emotions allowed. Or we think we do. You probably know someone who thinks that Spock, Data, and Sheldon are what we should all try to be. That they're somehow role models. You probably know someone who tried to be Spock, who tried, lit candles and tried to meditate, never show any emotions at all. And especially in programming communities that have roots in the 20th century, like ours, we often idolize that behavior. We say, that's what I'd like to do. Sometimes, unfortunately, these stupid emotions show up, but I'd like not to have any. That's just wrong. We say, I'm a debugger. I'm a coder. I know all the syntax of this insane language we love. And that's what matters. That's what's valuable. That's who should get paid the most. That's who should get promoted. That's who should get listened to. And those weird people who come to the meetings and persuade people, that's politics. That's yucky. That one person at the end who always listens and says, oh, I can see this is important to you, they're just weird. We think emotions are for the weak, and that where it's really at is in our code. In fact, the best times is when we can get away from the meetings, get away from the users, get away from the emotions, and get back into the code. Now, I hope that all of you know that that's nonsense. That when it comes to making software, the people skills, the emotional skills, the listening, the persuading, they're absolutely and totally vital. But that's a different keynote. I'm going to take that as read. I want to get to this one myth. There are no emotions in code. Who believes that? Yeah, I know, she wouldn't ask if it was true. I think you do believe that. But it's plenty of emotions in code. If you have a business rule that says that an item is overdue if its due date is before today, that's not an emotional rule, okay? And when your software runs, it isn't going to give someone a break because the weather was bad or because they're a cute little kid. So in that sense, there's no emotions in code. But in every other sense, I can see the emotions of the people who wrote and maintained the code right there on the screen. We all learned Boolean logic, yeah? True and true is true, but true and false is false. But before we learned Boolean logic, we learned prepositional logic, propositional logic. Socrates is a man, all men are mortals, therefore Socrates is mortal. Programmers are people, people have emotions. You can't resist this, you know what comes next. It's true, we do. Emotions are not for the weak, emotions are for people. And we have them, and they permeate our work. So if you've been to any of my talks about simple code, you've seen me put up code that's hard to read or maintain or understand and tell you what I don't like about it and make it better. And I had an interesting insight some time ago about the categories of badness that I see. So I see a lot of code that's commented out instead of deleted. All of the code I'm going to show you, and I'll show more at the beginning than at the end, but it's all from real projects in the wild. I just do a little redacting sometimes. I don't want someone to recognize their own line of code. In this particular system, there's a class which has member variables for the current values of two things, which I've called X and ABC here. But there are also globals for them, because it's a 25-year-old project. And apparently at one time, if either the current X or the current ABC was different in the class than in the globals, there was some special processing that you had to do. And that special processing has disappeared, but somebody decided they didn't want to lose the if. Right? It's a complicated if. I might need that again. So they just left it there, commented out as an empty if block. Because maybe I'm not right taking this away. Maybe I'm going to need this. Then there's the don't blame me comments we've all seen. I went looking for some and I found my very favorite. This is notice the date, 2003. This team was switching to Visual C++ 7, and it objected to uninitialized variables. They must have been on warning level 4, which you got to give them points for. But the person felt that they couldn't just march in there and stick an equals 0 on the end of their int n data, like some sort of marauding heathen. There was likely to be trouble at code review time. So they added this comment 15 years ago, pointing out that it was the compiler who was demanding that they initialize the variable. And that comment, and it has many brothers, I searched, has been there for 15 years. Here's what it used to be. We used to not initialize it, but now we do. Okay. Whew. I wouldn't have been able to follow this code base without that. And like, you know, the 15 years ago programmer is like, I'm safe now because I've put down that paper trail. No one's going to come after me. Large code bases are full of things that no one uses anymore. Variables get declared, never used. Get calculated, never used. Functions that are written, never called. Do we delete them? I might need them. I don't know why that's there. I don't know what will happen if I take it away. And in general, I don't have time to fix up this mess. I got things to do. We have a deadline. I know it's not right. I know this is not how we're supposed to live, right? I love especially the doubles, D1, D2, D3. This same code base also has strings that are called S1, S2, S3. It's taking the Hungarian thing way too far. But I can't risk telling whoever did this yesterday that the time has come to not do it this way anymore. I'm just going to keep my head down, do what the people before me did. All of this code shows fear. These are things that people do when they are afraid. And this was a huge revelation for me, because you can't bully people into not being afraid. I can't come in and say, this code base is terrible, you need to change your ways, when people have made that terrible code out of fear. And there is so much fear, I need another whole slide. You know you've seen this, checking things that do not need to be checked. My favorite is checking whether a pointer is null before you delete it. Deleting a null pointer is a no-op. Go ahead, delete it. I mean, why are you calling new and delete anyway, but that's a different thing. There is no need for this check, but you know you've seen it, right? You maybe even have a code base you own that can still hold it. I know I'm supposed to get a positive number, but I'm going to make sure it's positive. And not just with an assert either, like with a runtime check that's there in production. And I've asked people, why do you do that? You're supposed to get a positive number. Well, I can't be sure that my teammates haven't changed their code so that it no longer works. You have heard of tests, right? Like, isn't that a slightly more efficient way of making sure your teammates are still keeping their promises, is to test their code? No, I'll put runtime checks in my code. That's how we test around here. It's a real thing. And some of the hand-rolled stuff that I see is also driven by fear. Someone's been hurt by a library once. Now they're afraid to ever trust a library again. They need 100% control. They need to be able to step through in a debugger because they are afraid to use someone else's code. Fear is a very real driver of bad code. And that's very interesting to me as a consultant, because I cannot yell the fear out of people or bully the fear out of people or threaten the fear out of people. But it doesn't explain all the badness that there is. The other reason why people use teeny little variable names is often from a different emotion. I have heard this exact rejoinder when I ask someone, maybe for D1 we could put total shipping weight. Aren't you smart enough to figure that out yourself? Why do I have to hold your hand and baby you? Why should I explain myself to someone who isn't worthy of an explanation because they can't understand this code without an explanation? You know you've worked with this person. Perhaps when you were younger, you were this person. Worse than the D1s of this world are the aggressively non-name names. And I, about a year ago, swore off foo and bar forever. If I need a name, I make up a name. Ship. Update. Even a nonsense word. And I'll tell you why. It's not the swearing, by the way. For those who don't know, though, foobar, the two parts of foo and bar come from F-U-B-A-R, which itself comes from snafu. And this is Navy slang from a time when people were literally risking their lives in a war. And in a war, crappy things happen. We need to send another boat over there or we will lose that battle. Well, the only boat we have available, only half its stuff works. Well, if we don't send a boat, then zero stuff works. Send it. That's what it means to be a general. But if you're on the boat, you're going out to the battle and half your stuff doesn't work. And management knows. And they're sending you anyway. And that's what snafu means. Situation is normal. All messed up. Only when everything is broken does it become messed up beyond all recognition. And we take that foobar, that we're all going to die and our bosses don't care humor, and we use those for our random variables. I don't want to connect to that anymore. We're not going to die. We're making software. We're saving lives, but we're not risking our own. So I swore off foo and bar, and while I was at it, I swore off functions called f, vectors called v, and integers called I, even in sample code. Because these aren't just bad names, they're aggressively anti-names. They say, ha ha on you for wanting a name here. And why would I say that to my reader? I see also some writing your own isn't driven by fear, but by a belief that they are genuinely better than the implementers of any and all of the libraries on the planet. There's a really good cure for that. Just meet some library implementers. I've met library implementers. I do not think I am smarter than them. That's not a problem. If you haven't been lucky enough to meet a library implementer, you might believe that you are better than they are. And it is possible that you have a particular data set for which your own hand-rolled implementation is better. But most of the time, that's not the case. The other thing this persona does is sneer. You have a Slack, right? Or a Discord. Maybe you're still running HipChat or what have you. You've got some sort of thing where people type at each other, right? And you've got someone in there who says, losers. I have to meet the losers next week. Who says that the problem exists between the chair and the keyboard, PebCac, but not ironically about themselves, but about those stupid users who don't know how to work the software and click the wrong buttons and submit bugs that aren't bugs, and who answer questions by saying RTFM and let me Google that for you. Those people type the same stuff in their code. My favorite, slightly boulderized. It wasn't Steve, and he didn't say nonsense. But this is a real story. There was a multi-step business process, and let's say Steve had to do step 3 and Joe had to do step 4. And there was a difference of opinion about whether or not something needed to be deleted or some field needed to be updated in the database or something needed to be copied somewhere. And Joe pushed hard for Steve to not do these things, but Steve did them anyway. So what did Joe do? Why, he wrote code to undo them. But he then further labeled that code, undo Steve's nonsense. So their little feud could live forever in the code base. And cycles are being wasted, you know. Steve copies the file over to the archive directory, and 5 lines later, Joe deletes the file from the archive directory because he doesn't think Steve should have put it there. You ever wonder how consultants make money? It's not just disagreeing. It's not just saying, hey, my function gets called after you, buddy. I can win. It's going all the way to giving the function that name. All of this is about arrogance. And I read arrogance in code from people who are long gone. Another way consultants make money, by the way, is people think they have their employers over a barrel. Sooner or later, the employers come and ask me, does he really have us over a barrel? I've never been asked, does she really have us over a barrel? I usually can figure out pretty quickly, nope, you're okay. Here's what we're going to do. I keep coming back to not cleaning up because there are lots of different reasons why you don't clean up. There's another set of emotions that cause people not to clean up. If I clean up, I'm using up hours that I'm being measured on to make your job easier next time, so you'll get a better metric than me. I got tickets to close. I'll just put 37. It'll be fine. I know what 37 means. I know why it's 37. I don't have an investment to make. I'm just working for me. Public variable. I don't have to write those stupid gets and sets. Hey, even better, a global, right? Then I have to change all those parameters, all those signatures. Now I'll just stick it in a global. It'll be fine. I don't have to outrun the bear, as the old joke goes, right? I just have to outrun you. And if nobody else knows how this works, my job's safe. That's what they think. They're very selfish. Selfish code can happen to us all, especially in a crunch. If you've ever worked in crunch, there's a deadline coming, and in some cases, if the deadline isn't made, all of your work is going to be thrown away. We're not going to release this for next year's Christmas shopping season. You're just done. In the worst cases, you honestly believe the company will go under and your job will be gone. Everybody acts a little selfishly when they're under crunch. If the company keeps you under crunch all the time, this is what they will get for their trouble. How about this person? Yeah, it works. Sorta, mostly, kinda. Anyway, we got QA people to figure that out. If something's wrong, they'll bounce it back. Libraries? I got code to write. I can't be learning new crap. What's wrong with you? Gotta write 100,000 lines of code this week. Testing? Scripts? You want to automate this? Do you know how long it takes to set that kind of stuff up? I've seen that. No way. Listen, if you care, you go ahead and do it. I got code to type in. And of course, the copy-paste edit, right? Oh, I got 20 lines somewhere that's perfect. Well, not quite perfect, but pretty good for this. Refactor it into a function? I'm not going to think about that. I don't have time for thinking about that stuff. No. I'll copy it over. I'll change most of it. I actually once in code review, I said, why does this say session here for this variable? These aren't sessions that you're going through. They're, orders. Oh, well, it was session in the code I copied it from, and I understand that code. So if I change it to order here, I won't understand it as well. I have a friend who referees Canadian football, which is somewhat like American football, except that 4 downs is for babies. We just have 3. And he referees at the school level. And sometimes people get hurt, the clock stops. And he went over to a young fellow one time to help him up. He said, "Are you okay? What's hurt?" And the young person said, "My boss, the coach just told me to lie down." So they needed a timeout. That's how I feel about these people who are like, I wouldn't understand it if I changed the variable names from where I copied it from. Like, wow, that's a little more honest than would probably be smart for you. But these people have no commitment to the future, right? They're not willing to invest any time in saving time. And again, this is occasionally okay. If we are in crunch, you don't have an hour. Right? If your team already has a list in the lunchroom of who's getting a divorce, you cannot invest an hour right now in building some automation. I get that. But the rest of the time, and when the crunch is over, you're still behaving this way out of laziness. And laziness is a real thing. Right? We're not all paragons of virtue. Some of us do better than others at working hard, at doing what's required, and having that commitment to the future. Your code shows emotions. Yes, the line of code that says, if the due date is before today, the item is overdue, and here is how we process overdue items. Does not show emotion towards the person, the item, the overdueness, the fine. That's true. But everything else, your variable names, how are you storing due date? What type are you using? Are you using the chrono things? How are you calculating whether or not it's overdue? Is that a member function of something? What is it a member function of? What parameter does it take? What did you call that? All of that tells me about the emotions of the person who wrote that code the first time and the person who's maintained that code ever since. And I don't like reading code that shows fear and arrogance and selfishness and laziness. But for 40 years, I have been doing that. Well, so what? Why am I going to come here and tell you that there's emotions in your code? And forgive me, you're going to see them now. There's 3 reasons why this matters. First, at least in some cases, I felt less irritated. I still get pretty angry about the selfish, lazy, arrogant code. But when I see the code that's afraid, I feel a little better for it still being there. I feel kind of sorry for them. The same way if you see someone writing something woefully difficult in C++ 98, and you're like, oh, long ago person, I have some great news. If you see the person who's afraid of their deadline, the person who's afraid of being judged, the person who's afraid they'll need this line of code back, you can kind of feel nicer to them. That's a pleasanter way to live your life. But more importantly, you may need to make some changes to this team and this processes that the team uses as a result of what you read in the code. Surely there is source control. Why is the source control so unbaked into the minds of people that they just leave their commented out code there? Surely there are tests. Why are people so worried that what they're writing might not be okay that they just leave these strange comments there? Maybe there's a person on the team who's horrible, who shouldn't be on the team, or who needs an attitude adjustment. Once you can read the emotions in the code, you're in a much better place to actually move the needle on that code, rather than just telling people, hey, you should choose good variable names, and here's 10 tips for great variable names. And I've done that. I have got 10 tips for great variable names. But they land on stony soil if the person's not prepared to actually care whether or not they write good variable names. But also, I want to think about the emotions that I'm putting in the code that I write and in the code that I leave behind. So when I become aware that they're there, that they come through to the next reader, that can drive what I do. Now, I told a couple people what I was planning. And they said, oh, so we should try to write neutral code. There's no emotions in code. Oh, it turns out there is emotions in code. We should write no emotions in our code, right? No. Remember that Spock and Data and Sheldon are fictional. You cannot have neutral code. Some things are. A shopping list is probably neutral, right? Bread, milk, eggs. It doesn't have to be. Bread because someone left the bag open on the counter again. Okay, or bubble bath for my sweetie who needs a break tonight. You can write nice things on the shopping list. But mostly, shopping lists are neutral. But now imagine a love letter. Dear John, the weather here is fine. It has been busy. Is this, like John's not like, oh, well, that's just a neutral letter. That's fine, right? John is not getting the love vibe from this. I had to buy more bread, Or a letter of recommendation, not a, this is to confirm that Kate worked here kind of letter, but a you really want this person as your consultant, and it says, yeah, she's completely alive, I met her, and says she knows C++. That's not a neutral letter of recommendation. And your code can't be neutral either. There is no in-between. But here's the trick. Even if there was, why aim for that? Now you know the trick that there can be emotions in your code. You can choose what emotions to put in your code. So I would like my code to be confident and capable instead of timid and tentative and afraid and insecure. I would like my code to be reassuring and obvious, because that's better than being secretive or just thrown together without even thinking. I've advocated a lot for code that's open and transparent, because that's better than information hoarding. Selfish versus generous. And I would like my code to be humble instead of arrogant, and to be generous instead of selfish. That's my lodestar. And this really just come to me in the last year or so. When I think I'm finished, is my code these things? And if not, why not? I have it in me. It can be that. It snowed, yes? Anybody drive in the snow? Was it terrifying? You saw the widespread disruption on the news. I misheard her the first time. I thought she said widespread destruction. It's like, come on, people, it's like an inch of snow. In Canada, we know how to drive in the snow and on ice, and we know what to do if our cars skid, if the steering wheel doesn't work, if the brakes don't do what they're supposed to do. You can find yourself heading for a tree or a parked truck or a guardrail. And it's terrifying. And what most people do the first time they find themselves in that situation is their eyes lock onto, like that tree. Oh no, I don't want to hit that tree. And then they steer right into it. And so we are taught, look where you want to go. Look around for a gap, for something that's not a tree. Lock your eyes on it, regardless of where the car is headed. And your hands and feet will coordinate with the feedback from the car, and more times than not, they will get you to that gap, and you will not hit the tree. Now, this is literal advice, right? So the look in this means point your eyes and receive ocular signals to your brain. And the where you want to go refers to you personally being in a different place at a later time. Nothing metaphorical about it. But is this not the best metaphorical advice ever, right? Stop focusing on Joe, who was so rude to Steve and enshrined his name in a rude function call. Look where you want to go. Look where you want your code to be. I want you, when you're working, don't open up your million-line project and de-emotion it. But when you're working in something and you're done, I don't need this. I'm going to delete it. I have source control. I also have work notes. Right? So if I'm adding a report, I just open a Word document, designs go in there, pictures of whiteboards after meetings go in there, and if I rip out 100 lines of code that I know I don't need, they go in there too, that's fine. But they're not in the source anymore. And if I ever do have that little cold trickle of fear later, I can go in my work notes and get them back. I take the time to clean up. For me, for the team, for the future, for something. It's worth doing. I know I'm right, which means I'm confident to be able to explain it to you. The number one reason people don't explain code is they don't really understand it. It used to be broken, and then I came in here and put a -1 in, and then now that test passes, so that's great. What's the -1? Is that because of the null terminator? I don't really know. It just works now. So that's why that person isn't writing a comment, because they don't really know. If there's something in there that's just not how we do things anymore, fix it. I'm in here anyway. That's not how we do things here. Why are these macros here? I'm going to replace these macros with a template. It's going to be faster. It's going to be more debuggable. It's going to be better. This code shows confidence. I like leaving behind code that shows confidence, especially in a place where the source control tells you who wrote what file. I use libraries. The standard library is great because we can just take it as read that you're supposed to know how it works and what it does. But if I'm using someone else's library instead of writing my own JSON parser over the weekend, then I can put in a link to the documentation for the library I'm using and leave it at that. I like my comments to never sneer, right? It's a fine line. In some senses, leaving a comment at all says, now I know you probably don't understand this, so I'm going to explain it to you. So you want to make sure you hit the right tone. I liked this one that I found. Now the code is full of magic numbers, and you could argue that the person should have made, some local const or const exprs to hold the numbers, and they could have had names like page height and page width. But the comment says, set page size to standard 8.5 by 11, and then in brackets it adds 96 is DPI for WPF. Now, if you don't do any Windows programming, you may not know what WPF is, and DPI may not immediately say dots per inch to you, but in this context, those acronyms are okay. And then we set the height to 8.5 times 96 and the width to 11 times 96. And the comment explains it. And I found this in the wild, though. The 2 lines of code were the other way around. So they said 8.5 by 11, and then the code went 11 and 8.5. And I'm like, I'm switching that for the slide. Little things, though, right? Like, why jar the person? You've gone to the trouble to write this nice comment. Take that extra tiny moment of polish. Names. Oh, names matter so much. Now this code says, I may not be the best, even though I am very good. Humility is like Zen. If you think you have it, you don't. But you can try to write code that is a little bit humble. And oh, I love seeing someone who has thought, right? Who has come out with the old figure out what's going to change and encapsulate it game. Or as we love to say, you need to achieve an appropriate level of abstraction. We always like to criticize people. Oh, you haven't achieved an appropriate level of abstraction. What would be appropriate? Well, I know it when I see it. But I can read code and say, oh, this is nice. Someone's thought. Someone's put some time in here. They've cleaned up. Stuff is in the right order. Things have good names. The functions are nice lengths. There's not a bunch of 1-line functions. That's crazy talk. But there's no 5,000-line functions. I've told you before about the phone calls where people are like, so if you just go to line 8,792 in reports.cpp, and then we carry on from the middle of the switch statement and have our conversation. This person values information sharing and says, my job is safe if we can all do this. I like that person. They are showing generosity. I want a specific sidebar about naming, because naming is so hard. We are famous for how bad we are at it, right? Like RAII, which stands for Scope-Bound Lifetime Management. I once had to apologize to a copy editor in a book I was writing because I had a mutex, which was called mutex with a lowercase m, and it was an instance of the class mutex with a capital M, and the copy editor was going completely insane because simply by typeface I was distinguishing between the concept, the idea of a mutex, my actual variable, the class, and I apologized, and this is a true story. I said, yes, I call my mutex mutex. You need to understand my dog is called Puppy. But why? Why is naming hard? It requires empathy. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the person who needs to consume that name. And we actively reject empathy when it accidentally bubbles up in us. If you've got a 5,000-line function and you are refactoring out 100 lines here and 100 lines there, you are the consumer of this name. This is a pretty easy thing to do. These 100 lines set everything to do with shipping it. These 100 lines are for updating the inventory. You can give these functions names almost without thinking. People definitely do it without thinking, but you can give them good names almost without thinking. But you get a little more removed from the consumer. Maybe you're writing a class's API at the design stage. It's harder to figure out what these things should be called. And then if you're writing some external API that sits on the outside of your application that's called by strangers, right, it gets tougher again. Maybe, for example, you call marking an exam mark, but it turns out all your customers want to call that evaluate or receive results or something. Right? It becomes a challenge. And the more generic the code gets, the harder it is to name it. You know I love the algorithm header. I mean, genuinely love the algorithm header. And I've written courses on it. And I've taught many people a lot of algorithms on the fly because I go, that's find if. And they say, what? And we have a little talk. But I wanted to explain something to someone. And I said, well, you see, we have sort. Pretty straightforward. You give it a beginning and an end, which might be the beginning and end of the container, but doesn't have to be. And if you don't provide a predicate, it's fine. It'll sort them by being less. So if you had a bunch of integers, when you were finished sorting it, it might go 1, 2, 3. But you can pass in a predicate if you like. So if you have employees, you could sort them according to the commissions that they earned. And the people who earned the most commissions would be at the beginning of the collection or at the beginning of the sorted part of the collection. Okay, that's a smart thing. I'm glad they have that. I said, yeah, but the thing is, like, let's say it's employees, and let's say calculating their commissions is relatively expensive, and the sort's actually copying or moving them around inside the collection. And if I have 1,000 employees, I really care about my best, let's say 3 or 5. I don't really care who's 998th and who's 999th. So we have partial sort. It's pretty sweet. It guarantees that it moves the ones that should be at the beginning to the beginning and that they are in order, but everything else is in a not necessarily order, right? Because you don't care. That's quicker. Like, okay, that's good. I can see that. Partial sort, that's a smart thing. Boy, they really thought of everything. I'm like, but now imagine I have my 1,000 employees and they're sorted by last name as I'm doing something with them, but I need to pick out my best performers. If I partial sort them by their commissions, I'll permuted my collection, and I will need to resort it back by last name again when I need it for something. It's kind of dumb. The person I was talking to said, well, you could make a copy and then do a partial sort on that larger copy. I'm like, I could, but it's still kind of wasteful to copy all 1,000 if I only care about my 5. We have partial sort copy. Partial sort copy leaves the original alone and produces a smaller collection, which is in order, of your best whatever. And that was what this person needed, so they went on about their day. And every time I tell the story in this order, I tried telling it to someone who was very technical but knows no C++ whatsoever. It's a perfectly understandable story. But it's a trick, because it only works if you tell the story exactly like this. If you march up to someone who's never met the algorithm header and ask them what partial sort copy does, they do not know. And worse, if they need partial sort copy, they will not think of it or find it. I realized last fall this should be called top N. You all know what top N does, right? We're done. I don't have to tell the story about the sort and the partial sort and the blah blah. Turns out we suck at naming. But what harder thing is there to name than a generic library that will literally continue to be used after you're dead? Right? I saw this tweet last year. It's a true story. Travis here changed the name of the variable inside the code that the programmers see. Nothing the users saw. The variable the programmers see. From error message to help message. Do you think that would matter? I would have said it didn't matter. The messages got better. Because we do have emotions, and we do have empathy, and we do care. And a tiny little nudge will bring it out of us. Names really matter. I would not have bet on it, but now I'm going to use the power of that in what I do. I run a lot of other people's code. Sometimes it mostly works. Sometimes people have a very interesting definition of works. Like it compiles, but there's 73 errors, warnings. If there's ever 74 warnings, we have to go figure out what's going on. I would like it to compile and link with no warnings. Then there is, you always get an exception when you run it. Just hit continue, it's fine. Right? Come on. You've run one of these, you know one of these. Or sometimes it leaves a file in the working directory, and if you don't clear that out, it will blow hard next time. You have to clear that out. A lot of us have a little script that just checks for the file afterwards and deletes it. Like, what? No one's looked into this? No. It compiles, it links, it runs, it passes the tests, and there's more than 7 tests, right? There's actually tests, so that passing them means something. Right? This is code by someone who doesn't have to be asked to make it right, who makes it right. I love when I find well-used modern things. Not for the sake of, not as a mechanical substitution, but because they're the right thing to do in that circumstance. And it might be language features, might be using lambdas, using templates, using const. When I did the talk a couple years now at CppCon about not casting away const, and I introduced people to the mutable keyword, and there were several people on Twitter who were like, wow, that mutable thing seems like it might really catch on. And I worked out how old mutable was. I have a 25-year-old son. He is younger than mutable. So when I say modern, I'm not setting a super high bar. But, I can tell the difference between you are using this because it's right, and it makes this code better, and you are using this because all the cool kids are putting no except on everything today. I like to see someone who's actually crafting software as opposed to typing a lot of code as fast as they can. So modern practices includes things like automation, it includes things like tests, it includes things like, hey, there's products that will format your code for you. You don't actually have to, by hand, put in the spaces and whatnot. When I see this code, I recognize the commitment to the future. To that own person's future that'll make their life easier the next time they're in the code base, to the team's future. Yes, it is more work, but it's work that you intend to get a return on. It's the opposite of laziness. This is hardworking code. I want you to know there are emotions in your code so that you can choose to show the positive emotions in your code. Your code will naturally become easier to read. Not just because total shipping weight is easier to read than D7, but because code that no longer sneers at you, makes things harder for you just to make things harder for you, it actually lifts an emotional weight off you if it is more enjoyable to read and maintain that code. When you come in and reap the benefit of well-maintained code, you feel pleased even if it was you who did it. It's like if you ever do meal planning. You sit down and say, on Monday we're going to have this, on Tuesday we're going to have that. And on Thursday you're like, what are we going to eat? I don't know. Oh, there's a list on the fridge. Oh, spaghetti. I can do that. And then you feel like this wave of gratitude towards the meal planning fairy who put this list on your fridge. Was yourself. That's what you do in your code. It is more enjoyable. You get these little gifts back the next time you go into the code. And your reputation will include this code that you are leaving behind. So even if you don't make the code better, there's a lot to be gained from putting positive emotions into your code. But I actually put it to you that you will make the code better as well. And that's what I want you to do. Not open up the million line project, start in a17.cpp, but when you're working, show your confidence. You've got this, right? You know what this does. You just figured out what this does. Don't throw that away. Put it in the code. So the next person not only knows what it does, they know that you know what it does. Embrace your own empathy and generosity. You will probably be the beneficiary of it. But even if you're not, it actually turns out to be a very nice way to spend your days, so do it. Help your users, help your team, give things good names, be proud of giving things good names because it is damn hard work. You're going to show emotions in your code. You are. So put in the work to make them positive emotions instead of negative ones, because we cannot escape our own humanity. Thank you.